Hello chess friends! In this video I'm going to be covering one of Magnus Carlsen's most heartless performances from his youth, a game from the 2005 Norwegian Chess Championship in which the 14-year-old Magnus totally decimates a 2400 rated player named Atle Groen, achieving a winning position by move 8, which results in a forced checkmate in 6 by move 22. You will rarely see a master level player get schooled so harshly and with such clinical accuracy so early in the game for simply neglecting his opening principles in the pursuit of cheap threats. So enjoy this masterclass on how to punish your opponent's errant behavior right out of the opening by a young Carlsen demonstrating a level of mastery far beyond his years. Magnus Carlsen, playing white, begins the game with knight to f3. We have d5 from Groen, d4, knight to f6, c4, and a typical Slav defense with c6, knight to c3, e6, bishop g5 from Carlsen, h6, bishop drops back to h4, and now we have a move which is not typical. We have queen to b6. Groen is playing for cheap threats at the expense of the harmonious development of his pieces. So with this move, he's targeting the undefended pawn on b2, some pressure on d4. The main problem with this move is that it blocks the b pawn. This is how black would like to get his bishop into the game. As you can see, he's got this nice strong pawn structure with the d5 pawn solidly supported. But a main problem in this opening for black is how to get this bishop on an active diagonal. And the way most players prefer to do that is by moving the b pawn to either b6 or b5. So a more common line would be for black to play knight b to d7 and wait for white to develop his light squared bishop. Whenever bishop d3 is played, then you take on c4, so that after capturing on c4, white has moved his bishop twice, and then you can kick the bishop with b5, and then play bishop b7, and hopefully get in the move c5 at some point, bringing your bishop to life along this beautiful diagonal, cutting through the center of the board. But instead, Groen opts for queen to b6, and Carlsen simply defends the pawn on b2 with queen to c2. And he already has a threat here. This queen is looking at an undefended piece, which means there's a threat of taking on f6, followed by taking multiple times on the d5 square, taking advantage of the pin on the c6 pawn. If c takes d5, then black is losing the bishop. So at this point, maybe best for black would be bishop e7. That way, if white were to take out the knight on f6 to remove the defense of the d5 pawn, then bishop takes f6. Black could have the counterattack on the d pawn. Once c takes d5 is played, it would be bishop takes d4. But Groen, instead of developing a piece preparing to castle, he decides to get aggressive with knight to e4, violating a very general opening principle which says don't move the same piece twice in the opening unless you have good reason to, which he does not here. But again, he's playing for cheap threats. He's targeting this knight, which he's going to target further in a moment. Carlsen coolly plays the move e3, preparing to develop his bishop and castle, which is what Groen should have been doing. Now we see Groen's plan, bishop to b4. Pinning the knight on c3, Carlsen doesn't mind. He plays bishop to d3, and here Groen again moves a piece twice in the opening, moving the queen to a5, increasing the pressure on the pinned c3 knight, and looking to win a pawn. But there is only so much piece development that you should sacrifice in order to gain a pawn, and at this point, Groen is already lost, according to the engine. Carlsen plays what's most likely the best move here. He just simply castles, and gladly gives up the pawn after knight takes c3, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, hitting the rook. Carlsen moves the rook out of danger while placing it on a better square, looking down this half-open file. Now if we look at the position, we see that while black does have an extra pawn, white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 developing moves, if you count castling, which you should, versus black's 2 pieces developed. Now if you consider that one developing move in the opening is worth 1/3 of a pawn, a common piece of wisdom you'll hear in some beginning chess books. If you count up the value of the developing moves for each player, Carlsen would have 2 pawns worth of developing moves made versus Groen's 2/3 of a pawn. So Carlsen has 1 1/3 pawns more worth of developing moves than Groen does to compensate him for his 1 pawn that he's lost in actual material. But it's actually worse than that for Groen, because now he's in a bit of an awkward situation with this bishop, which Carlsen is threatening to trap with the move a3. Now that bishop has no squares. Queen takes a3 is not helping. Rook to b3 just simply wins the bishop. So Groen, realizing this, plays what is probably his best move at this point. He takes the pawn on c4. Now we can play bishop to b4 and escape this direction. If you were to try bishop b4 without taking that pawn, then there'd be c5. And the bishop is again trapped and will be won. So d takes c4, best try. Now bishop takes c4. The bishop goes to b4. And Carlsen plays a strong move, knight to e5. He's undoubtedly already thinking about targeting that f7 pawn. You will find that that square is often a prime candidate for a piece sacrifice when your opponent has severely neglected his development. Now Groen drops his bishop back to d6, getting it out of the view of the rook, and probably thinking about taking out that knight on e5 before something terrible happens. Carlsen just supports his knight with f4. It's a good move, but he already could have sacrificed his knight on f7. And there's an incredible variation that the engine found that you're just not going to believe. You got to check this out. I'm going to go through it quickly. Knight takes f7, king takes f7. Now what do you think the follow-up is here for white? What's the strongest move? Rook takes b7. Second piece sacrificed, a whole rook. Bishop takes b7. And what do you think's next? Bishop takes e6. And you would think that white has sacrificed too much material here to be able to win, but you would be wrong. After king takes e6, we got queen g6 check, king d7, queen g7 check, which will pick up the rook. If the king goes to c8, there's a nice little staircase effect here where the queen keeps checking the black king, getting closer, and eventually there's this mate with queen d8. Then there's the other option where the king goes to e8. Again, we take the rook, and here you can block with the bishop, but white still wins with queen to h7, hitting this bishop. Queen g6 is the threat. The computer is giving this line with bishop to a6, and then we check, and then the king goes this way. Again, the queen gets closer, taking the bishop, driving the king to the open file, and then at some point the rook can get involved. So that's a pretty insane computer line that I'm not going to be able to explore thoroughly, but I thought I'd just show you that. In the game we had f4. Groen plays queen to c7, adding some defense to the weak f7 square. Maybe he realized that taking the knight with bishop takes e5 wasn't going to help his situation after f takes e5. Now the f file's open towards the king, but probably even worse is the idea of queen to e4, bishop d3, forming the battery towards the king side, so black will not survive that variation. So queen c7 is what is tried, and Carlsen can still take on f7 here, which is probably the best move, but he plays it safe with the move queen to e4. He's planning knight takes f7, but he's getting his queen to a useful square first. Opposite the black king, also providing some lateral protection to the bishop on h4. You'll see why that's significant in a moment. Queen e4 is probably not the absolute best move, though it is totally winning because it gives black the option of f5. And after queen f3, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and black is totally lost here. He's way behind in development. This bishop has no scope, but maybe practically this was his best chance. But instead, seemingly oblivious to the danger to his f7 pawn, Groen just plays b6. Apparently planning to develop his light squared bishop, maybe to a6. It would be good if he could trade off those light squared bishops. This is a bad bishop for him. But this is just way too slow and does not address the looming threats to his king, which Carlsen decides it's time to fully exploit with the piece sacrifice. Knight takes f7. Groen recaptures with the queen, and now f5. Looking to win the pawn on e6, which is pinned in two different ways. That pawn is attacked 3 times, only defended twice. So black has no good way to save that pawn. And sadly, that pawn is the last remnant of the shield in front of his king. Carlsen's biggest threat here is to take on e6 with the pawn, hitting the queen, which must keep defensive g6, because if the white queen can land there, that's checkmate. The bishop on h4 is covering e7 and d8. This rook is covering f8. The pawn's got the remaining squares covered. So after a move like queen h5, you could play bishop to e2. And now you have to sacrifice your queen in order to avoid checkmate, because if you take the bishop, queen g6, checkmate. So Groen, apparently in anticipation of this problem, moves his queen to h5, so she will not be attacked if Carlsen plays f takes e6. But Carlsen plays bishop takes e6, which is equally devastating. Now he's got the threat of a discovered check with bishop takes c8. So Groen blocks this with knight d7. Now if bishop takes d7, the king can capture. The discovered check is not winning a piece. But now Carlsen plays an absolutely crushing move, f6. Threatening to take on g7, threatening bishop g4 discovered check, winning the queen. So Groen attempts to answer all the threats with the move knight to f6. Comes with an attack on white's queen, which will be taken out if Carlsen tries to execute his discovered check. But here Carlsen finds the most decisive move. What would you play here as white? Carlsen plays rook takes f6. This is much superior to bishop takes f6, which would give the black queen access to the h2 square supported by the bishop. So there'd be queen takes h2 check, king moves, then there'd be g takes f6. Of course, white would get his discovered check with bishop c8 check, king moves, and after something like bishop e6, white is still totally winning here because the black king is so vulnerable, but rook takes f6 is a move that black just cannot deal with at all. If you take the rook, then there's bishop g4 check, winning the queen. So what Groen tries is sacrificing the queen with queen takes h4. And how many of you in this position would just reflexively take the queen on h4 with a totally winning position for white? After g takes f6, queen takes f6, black only has a rook and a minor piece for the queen, and has an extremely weak king. But Carlsen is not one to miss a checkmate in 6 moves. At least not in this game. He finds queen takes c6 check. Groen plays king to e7, maybe thinking he can survive. After all, he is a piece up. But Carlsen found the correct move. What would you play here as white to force mate? Rook to f7 check. This move takes protection off of the bishop, which Groen captured. Apparently missing that queen c4 is checkmate. A beautiful finish. The rook is covering these squares, the pawn is covering that square, and the queen covering d5, defending the rook through the king. If Groen wanted the game to last a few more moves, he could have played king d8, but then Carlsen could finish him with the following. Rook d7 check, and obviously if the rook's taken, queen takes d7 is mate, but after king e8, there's bishop f7 check, king f8, queen takes d6. Black's only move would be to put the queen in the way, after which queen takes e7 is checkmate. So that concludes my coverage of another brilliant game by a young Magnus Carlsen. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel to be notified of more analysis like this coming your way in the very near future.